Uncle Dan said to me, "Show me your hands. Let me see." I curled my fingers, clenched them tightly, and hid them behind my back. My hands are clean. I washed them this morning. Uncle Dan chuckled. "I'm not going to examine your hands. Just spread your fingers so I can see how many flower fingers you have." Behind my back, my hands relaxed. I held out my left hand in front of Uncle Dan, puzzled. "What are flower fingers, Uncle?" Uncle Dan raised his eyebrows at me. "You're this old and you don't know what flower fingers are?" He took my hand and slowly explained. "Flower fingers are the circular patterns on the tips of your fingers. The more flower fingers you have, the better your drawing will be. If you have 10 flower fingers, you'll draw the best in class. You'll even write the most beautifully in class." I nervously watched Uncle Dan examine each of my fingers. It felt like he was studying the veins on 5 leaves. I held my breath and asked, "How many flower fingers do I have, Uncle?" Uncle Dan shook his head, disappointed. "None at all." I repeated, feeling sad. "None at all." For a moment, it felt like my vision went dark. My heart tightened and sank somewhere far away, maybe to the tips of my toes. "Don't worry," Uncle Dan said, warming me with his gaze. "You don't know how to draw with your left hand, right? Your right hand is the important one. Now, show me your right hand." I felt like I had just been pulled out of the water. I quickly extended my right hand, and Uncle Dan carefully lifted it close to his eyes. This time, his movements were slow and deliberate, as if he thought quick actions might disturb the fingerprints. Even when searching for the circular patterns on my fingers, he looked even more focused. I could see him pursing his lips and furrowing his brow, as if he were examining insects through a magnifying glass. "Ah, there's one here already," Uncle Dan exclaimed joyfully. "A flower finger, Uncle?" I anxiously blurted out, trying to hold back a cheer, afraid I had misheard. "Yes, a flower finger." Uncle Dan's face lit up as if a candle had been lit in his eyes. "There's a flower finger on your thumb." I shakily asked, "Uncle, what about the other fingers?" Uncle Dan clicked his tongue. "Wait a moment." He tilted his head and gently examined each of my fingers with both his hands and eyes, muttering with delight. "Index finger, T-esque, it's ruined. Middle finger, oh, I don't see anything here either. Ah, here's one. Another flower finger." I asked again, as if in a daze, "A flower finger, Uncle?" "Hey, you." Uncle Dan scolded me, but his eyes said the opposite. "I'm looking for your flower fingers." But that was the last flower finger he found. My right little finger had no flower finger at all. So I only had 2 flower fingers, one on my thumb and one on my ring finger. Uncle Dan told me to look at the tips of each of my fingers, and then he began to explain. Just as Uncle Dan said, the patterns on the tip of my right ring finger were circular, with the smallest circle in the center, as tiny as a sesame seed, followed by larger rings stacked like ripples when I mischievously threw a stone into a pond. The flower finger on my thumb wasn't as regular, with the lines twisting into each other like a whirlpool, but Uncle Dan said it was still a flower finger, though it wasn't as beautiful as the one on my ring finger. He looked out the window, squinting. "Look outside. There are many kinds of flowers, but not all flowers are equally beautiful, right?" From that day on, I grabbed everyone I met and insisted they show me their flower fingers. My younger brother, Tuong, had 6 flower fingers, which left me astonished. "Wow, you have so many flower fingers. When you grow up, you'll draw and write really well. What are flower fingers?" Now it was Tuong's turn to ask me, and I explained to him. He widened his eyes and asked, "How many flower fingers do you have, brother?" fingers and said enviously, "You really have a lot of flower fingers. If each of your hands had 6 fingers like Mr. Nambi."